Okay, so our first lesson that we're going over is going to essentially just be solving equations, but I think most of you guys feel comfortable with solving equations by now, so I'm going to deal with a specific case that you guys might not enjoy, and that would be solving equations when they have fractions present. Many of you guys are like Mr. Dotson here, and you don't really enjoy fractions very much. So what are you guys going to do if you have fractions that show up in your equations? We need to multiply by their common denominator. And if you multiply by their common denominator, it will essentially eliminate the fractions. So if I look at my first example that I put up here on the board, x over 2 plus x minus 3 over 6 equals 1/3, I need to look at all of their denominators there and find their common denominator. So if I've got 2, 6, and 3, I could multiply this entire thing up here by their common denominator, which is 6, and then that will essentially eliminate all of the fractions and make it much easier to solve. Okay, we're going to practice a few examples, so if you guys want to flip this page over to the back, we could go ahead and get those done. So one of the common examples, and I expect that you could see something like this on your test, would be if you were dealing with something like 1 over x squared plus, let's say, 2 over x. Let's just do plus 1 equals 0. Okay, so I've got 1 over x squared plus 2 over x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, some of these you guys don't have to multiply by the common denominator, but this one you do. And the reason that you have to multiply by the common denominator on this one is because there are x's that are on the bottom. If we have x values on the bottom, we have to multiply by that common denominator. So our common denominator for this one would be an x squared. If I was trying to add all these terms together, I'd multiply this times x and this times x. I'd put that over 1, and I have to multiply that by x squared. Okay? They would all have an x squared as their denominator. So our common denominator for this one is going to be x squared. Let me get rid of all this jazz. Okay, so I need to take this whole problem times x squared. I've got to distribute that x squared to everything up here. Okay, when I do that, I get a 1 over x squared times x squared plus a 2 over x times x squared plus a 1 times x squared equals a 0 times x squared. And yes, you do have to take that x squared to the other side of the equal sign as well. Everything has to be multiplied by it. Now, when I start breaking this down, I've got a 1 over x squared times an x squared. Well, that is essentially an x squared over 1, so these would cancel. So I am only left with a 1 at this spot here. Okay? Next, I'm going to look at a 2 over x times an x squared. Again, that's an x squared over 1, so I can cancel one of my x's. And when I do that, I'm left with a 2x. My last one I have here is a 1 times x squared. There's nothing to cancel there, so that's just going to give me just a positive x squared. And then I've got a 0 times x squared. Well, 0 times x squared is just going to give me 0. Anything times 0 just gives us 0. Okay? So, I've gotten rid of the fraction. Now, I have an x squared and an x. If you have an x squared and an x, you're going to have to factor to solve these problems. Okay? So I'm going to put this in a standard form, which essentially I'm just going to reorder it. So it's x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 0. Okay? After I do that, I'm going to need to factor. We need factors of 1 times 1, factors of 1 that will add to give me 2. So that would just be 1 and 1. And then I'm going to kind of skip our factoring steps because we've done those before, but this factors to an x plus 1 times an x plus 1 equals 0, or you could say that's an x plus 1 squared equals 0. Remember, we set both of the factors equal to 0, In this case, there's just one of them. Whoops. So it's just essentially x plus 1 equals 0, and I get that x equals -1. Okay. One thing that you do have to pay attention to when you are working with these problems here, we found that x equals -1. So if I scroll back up here, I do need to check and make sure. We've talked about the domain. There would be some domain concerns on this problem here, right? My concern would be that my x could not equal 0. Okay, so before I circle my answer on this, I should have checked back up at the beginning and made sure that I could plug this in. Okay, if you got a problem where you could not plug it in, then you would just say that there is no solution for that problem. I believe on your guys' homework assignment there is one problem like that. Okay, just one other one, and we're not going to work all the way through it, but you guys can see a problem that looks like 2 over x plus 2 plus 3 over x minus 3 equals 7. Okay, if you guys were working out a problem like this, the common denominator of this would be x plus 2 times x minus 3, and that would have to distribute to everything up here. Okay, so I'd have a 2 over x plus 2 times x plus 2 times x minus 3, and then I'd have a plus 3 over x minus 3, and I'd be taking that times x plus 2 times x minus 3. Okay, and then that would equal a 7, and then that 7 I'm also taking times x plus 2 times x minus 3. Okay, so when I do a problem that looks like this, my x plus 2's would cancel here, and I'd be left with a 2 times x minus 3. My x minus 3's would cancel here, and I'd be left with a positive 3 times x plus 2. And then on the other side, I'd have a 7 times x plus 2 times x minus 3. That would give me a 7 times x squared minus x minus 6. Okay, I'd need to distribute. That would give me a 2x minus 6 plus 3x plus 6 equals 7x squared minus 7x minus 42. Okay, and once I got it down to this point here, okay, I've got x's and I've got x squareds. I'm going to have to factor that to solve. So I would need to combine my x's together, combine my 6's together, and then I would need to get everything moved over to one side of the fraction so that it equaled 0, and then I would factor. Okay, and if you couldn't factor, we're going to talk about that in one of our other later slides here. You could either complete the square, or you guys could use your quadratic formula, which I would suggest using the quadratic formula, but we'll talk about that later. So that's all for this one here. If you guys have any questions on your homework, just ask.